Guys, back. We start. Because there's people, some people say I should talk about all of them, and then this course will go on forever. So let me abbreviate. I can talk about each and every one of them for hours, but what I'm trying to say that somehow, at that point, after the victory over Persians, Athens becomes this place beyond words. They create everything we got, they create. And everything they create, every single household item we dig out, we put in our great museums. I mean, sort of literally all of the amphoras, all of the household things which we find are of beauty unbelievable, nothing we could ever sort of aspire to catch. I mean, sort of catching up with the Greeks would try and try again. In terms of beauty, no. There is no. So there is this great place. And as, again, they create great drama, greatest ever. And in some sense, they start with a sort of very great drama, then reach the peak, and toward the end with Euripides, they create as decadent, as sort of fin de cycle I have now. I mean, the sort of the end of the, there is a technical term, sort of, the, if you like, somewhat corrupt, somewhat exaggerated drama as you could imagine. So nothing to do after them. You might as well pack the bags and go. So they don't just write this place. They force every single citizen to go and attend this place. And if you have no money and you say, I have to go work, write code, they pay you your daily wage to go attend this thing. They take their culture very seriously. This is not for snobs. It's truly the only time in the history of the world where the culture, which is extremely great, probably the greatest ever, is also happens to be the popular culture. Everybody participates. This is not for the rich. Rich compete for the honor of staging this place. Right? It's a great honor. Richer you are, how do you prove you're important? You say, I'm going to pay Sophocles to put up a next production of Oedipus Rex or something. Right? And they do. So an amazing, amazing place. Of course, in the 5th century, the golden age, the age when they develop all these great arts, when they, and there are some people who are missing. For example, Herodotus, the father of history, is not here. Somehow he's not on the list. Anybody knows why? I mean, he writes in Athens. He writes about Athens. So why did Alex not put him there? Because he's actually from Halicarnassus. So everybody who is not an Athenian, but who has any idea, still goes to Athens. I mean, next century, there is this guy called Aristotle. He doesn't stay in Stagira. He goes to Athens. Well, to Plato to study, but to Athens. That's the place. That's where all the wisdom, that's all the beauty. In his great Thucydides, in his probably the greatest historian ever, not the father of history, that's Herodotus, but a historian of unbelievable depth and tragedy. Sort of this is a history, if you ever want to read history, which shows what we are as a species, read Thucydides. This is a great Athenian patriot, writes about Athenian war, you know, Peloponnesian War when Athens fighting Sparta. And he describes how this great enlightened power becomes a terrible, brutal thing which destroys innocence. He's an Athenian patriot, but he's not going to lie. Of course, he is exiled, as any good general is going to be. So But in the beginning of his book, there is a great oration by Pericles, a great leader of Athens. So when we talk about Athens during that period, we talk about Athens of Pericles. That's the reference to that period. And there is this speech where he describes how great Athens are. They're fighting this terrible war, which they're going to lose. After many, many terrible battles and ups and downs, through their own hubris, of course, as you know, how else? But in the beginning, before Pericles dies, he dies in the beginning of the war, he gives this speech where he talks about how great Athens is and how its freedom allowed it to produce the great patrimony of arts and sciences, and how they became the school of Hellas, the school of Greece. But of course now we know better. It was the school of the world. Every time we have something wonderful, it's a renaissance. Why do we say it's a renaissance? Renaissance of what they created. So something of unbelievable level. Again, what's the reason? We don't know the reason. The olives. I have to tell you, since I mentioned the olives, I have to tell you the story, of course. Olives was central to Athens. The founding myth of Athens, that in the beginning, long time ago, there are two gods competing for which one is going to be a patron god of Athens. Poseidon, the sea god, and Athene, Pallas, the great goddess of wisdom. And they gave two gifts to compete. Poseidon gave the stream of clear water from the rock. And Athene gave an olive tree. And that becomes, for Athens, is this central thing. Their greatness, in some sense, is built around their olive oil. That's what they sell all over the world. But of course, there is a profound thing about Athene being the goddess, which is a patron goddess of the city, because she came from the head of Zeus. I'm not going to explain. You have to figure out yourself. Well, so they were wonderful people. But you will see wonderful people could do terrible things. So they were this school of Hellas, school of us all. And somewhere around 1427, we know pretty much exactly when he was born, a kid was born there. He was not called Plato. He was called Ariston. He came from a wonderful family, sort of very aristocratic. The kings, you know, on both sides, sort of, they're just very old, very established, very prominent, true aristocracy. You know, for a French, it's saying somebody's Montmorency. It's a great family, right? Sort of. So comes from a great family, very gifted, extremely gifted. Writes beautiful poems. We have few surviving. I'll show you one. Very strong and very handsome. This is how he looked when he was old, and still very impressive, handsome. He was probably like 70 when this is. He lived till about 81. So a strong guy, a wonderful wrestler. And his coach called him Platon, the broad one, because of his breadth and strength. He was an Olympic class wrestler. So, of course, he's born in 427 BC. He fights in the war with his brothers. He has two brothers. I don't have many sisters. But we know that he has at least two brothers. Fights in the war. We don't know much, but you know, there's nothing disgraceful. So probably fights bravely. And of course, he wants to be, what would you want to be if you were in Athens that time? A playwright, guys, playwright. That's how you become famous. That's how, that's the greatest people in Athens, people who write plays. He wants a poet playwright. by the way, why I'm talking about him, couple of ideas. This is a nice quote. Everybody should know it. Basically, everything we have been doing for the last 2,500 years or so are just a commentary on his works. And footnotes, minor footnotes, usually. Well, if you're somebody great, you cut it into footnotes. So this is not, you know who Whitehead was, yes? He was a friend of Russell, senior friend, more important friend. And Russell and Whitehead wrote this Principia Mathematica, which we'll encounter toward the fourth journey. So he was important, this young kid, became important. This is I Couldn't Resist. This is a very beautiful little poem which survives in Greek anthology, a collection of little epigrams which Greeks sort of left us. And he talks to Astor, his friend, maybe the beloved, but don't take it as simply and as it would be taken today, a male beloved, which was totally normal in Greece. Of course, in case of Plato, he would always write that nothing except a chaste kiss is allowed between lover and the beloved. So don't. So you gaze at stars, my Astor, or that I were heaven to look back at you with innumerable eyes. It's very, in Greek it's much more beautiful. You got the idea. The conjecture is that Astor was enamored by astronomy. You look at stars, my Astor. Astor means star. So it's actually in Greek, it's better. You look at stars, my star. It's wonderful. Great, great poet. And then something happens to him. He gets into a bad company, bad influence. This guy. This is how he looked. Socrates. A very disreputable kind of a chap. First of all, I mean, he has no money. Not a good family. He's either a stone cutter or sculptor, but disreputable kind, right? And again, he has no money and wouldn't even work, right? So what does he do? First of all, he doesn't do anything, sort of on purpose. He wanders around Athens asking people questions. Bad idea, guys. You don't, if you want to do, especially he asks management questions. So, remember, if you want worldly success, don't ask questions during all hands. And we're going to have all hands next week. There'll be no class. So remember that. So this guy goes around and asks questions. Like there's some famous general. He would go and ask himself, what's the meaning of sort of how do you fight battles? How do you organize an army? So what is the right way of doing things? Disclaims any knowledge of anything. Just ask questions. But all the best and the brightest, all the people like Plato, suddenly see that this ugly guy, look at him. And it's one thing we know historically absolutely certain is that Socrates was ugly. Right? There's just no questions about it. So this ugly guy, which looks like just a mask. Everybody comments, Plato comments on it in Symposium, that he looks just as a mask of an ugly sort of thing. And poor, disreputable, no participation in politics in this very political society where everybody has to participate. He never runs for any office. He doesn't want any office. He doesn't want anything. He just wants to get to the truth. And the young people start walking around with him because they want to see how he examines politicians. His questions to management are actually good questions. And management, of course, doesn't like his questions at all. And people start sort of, there is parties. There's some people who say, oh, he's doing great things for us, and some people he's destroying the foundation of the society. And I cannot tell you everything about Socrates because it's actually a course about mathematics, but he's central to the story. I have to mention him. So what happens that in the year 399, a bunch of well-meaning citizens take him to court. So they say that he attacks divinities, undermines the morale of the young people, all the things I'm doing here. So, but no, I'm not comparing myself. No. So these are pieces from a little book by Plato called Apology. This is Socrates' speech during this court proceedings, during his trial. So he says few things which are sort of, I neither know nor think that I know, no pretense. He does not possess any knowledge. But by the way, this is why he is the wisest of the Greeks, apparently, because at least he knows the second one. He knows that right? Then, but on the other hand, he makes an extremely strong statement, an immortal statement in some sense. He says that unless you question, unless you examine life, unless you take these things seriously, it's actually not worth living. Even if you could afford a BMW, it's still not worth living. I don't know if he mentioned BMW, but so he clearly sort of takes a very unusual attitude. Well, guess how they vote. I mean, first they vote him guilty with a small margin. And then they ask him, don't forget, they invented open trial by jury. So all the good things they invent. So, and now they use this wonderful jury system, being tried by your equals, right? And they, of course, find him guilty. And they ask him, what kind of penalty do you want? And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to kneel in front of them and say, oh, please whip me, or please put me on a diet, or something. Yes? And then they'll say, okay, he's an old man, we'll let him go. No, Socrates doesn't do that. He says, I think the fitting penalty for what I do in Athens would be a free dinner at the government expense, and good one, every day. So guess what happens? When they decide to determine which vote, they give him death penalty by far larger margin than the people, because they get annoyed. And then he concludes this sort of, literally his last words. He says, the hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live. Which is better, God only knows. He's not afraid to die, which is this amazing thing. I mean, he says, well, and later on, we know that his disciples come and say, oh, we bribe the people, and they don't really want to execute him. They want to humiliate him. So they would let him escape. No, he wouldn't let them get away cheaply. He drinks the poison. He dies. In 399, this is, if you remember one date from this course, this is the date 399 BC, Socrates dies. And when Plato writes later on a dialogue about the last day of Socrates, Phaedo, a great dialogue, we see one of these very few, two actually, mentions of Plato himself in Plato's work. He's always anonymous. He's never present. You never know his opinion. But one thing we know from Phaedo, that when Socrates is going to die, he cannot come to see him. He is sick. Apparently, he was so distraught he couldn't move. He couldn't come to see his teacher die. After Socrates dies, he cannot stay in Athens. This is the place which killed the wisest. The only wise man who ever visited Earth was killed by this perfect, beautiful, democratic system, by the popular vote. So he lives. He cannot take it anymore. He will never, ever come back. It's not true, but for many years he goes away. And this is he's a typical Greek. He's very curious. So he goes away for about 12 years and travels extensively. Goes to Megara, where he studies with Euclid, quite a different Euclid from the Euclid, Euclid of Megara. Then he goes to Cyrene, remember we mentioned when we talk about Aristophanes, Eratosthenes. Then he goes to Heliopolis in Egypt, where he studies with the priest for many years. And then he goes to Tarentum, where he meets Archytas and works with Pythagoreans, and ends up in Syracuse. By the way, Syracuse and Plato are very sort of close connection. He keeps going and going to Syracuse because they keep inviting him to reform the society. And first time he visits it, he is sold to slavery. So when big bosses invite you to teach them wisdom, be careful. That was, he tried, and first time he was sold to slavery. So at about 385, he goes back to Athens because he learned all these things, and he comes with a brilliant idea, which nobody ever came with before. He says, I have to start a place where people could learn freely, no tuition, openly, not like with Pythagoreans, secret teaching. Open place, and what does he do? He buys a garden dedicated to a hero called Academus, and they call the garden Academia. So that's why when you go to university or whatever they say, academia, academic things, it all goes to Plato. He invents a university. You say, well, I mean, self-evident idea. Apparently not. Apparently nobody till Plato came up with an idea of starting a place where you could go and regularly study some fundamental subject, not to study, how to be a baker and a butcher, that of course existed before, but to study useless things. Because what do you study? You study for 15 years, by the way. First 10 years, it is just mathematics. Right? Because nobody is mature enough to consider philosophy, which sort of a political science, till he goes to 10 years of rigorous mathematical studies. Right? So he takes this esoteric teaching, which he learned from Pythagoras, and he makes it available to everyone. Everyone should learn it. It should be the foundation. His great idea that if you educate people well, if they learn mathematics, they'll become good. We know he's mistaken, but he didn't know. He tried. So a great idea. And of course, after a while, he gets invited by his friend Dion, who lives in Syracuse, to go back to Syracuse again to teach Dionysius the Younger, the son of the guy who just sold him to slavery a few years back. He wants to learn philosophy. So Plato drops his presidency of the university, goes to Syracuse. And believe it or not, first few months, great success. I mean, the quote from Plutarch is, the place was filled with sawdust. They bring sawdust because everybody wants to do geometry. And that's how they draw things in sawdust. Sand too, but that was. So everybody, all the courtiers now want to do geometry. About 3 months it goes well. And the tyrant, that was the official title of the head of the government, Dionysius the Younger, is making all kind of philosophical progress for about 3 months. Well, then the military guys get annoyed because, if we are going to have philosophers in charge, the military budget will go down. And therefore, they start making plans of how to get rid of him. And his friend, the tyrant, says, oh, what a good idea if I appoint him to be the head of the military. So fortunately, his Pythagorean friends, Archytas in particular, managed to smuggle him out. And then he goes there again. So again, sort of, he had this, and I've been reading Plato since I was 15. I had a great history teacher who gave me Plato to read, and I never stopped. So many, many years of Plato. So when you read Plato for as many years as I have, he was very wise, but you also know that he had this very cynical view of us. So he knew what they would do to him in Syracuse, but he keeps going because it is his duty. It's this very sad thing where a very great man drops everything he does and goes and does this useless things, trying to teach tyrants about wisdom. He dies an old man, fairly bitter. Toward the end, his writings become darker and darker and darker. He sees that there is actually no hope. No amount of mathematics, no amount of philosophy will ever make human beings better. But he still writes. He still writes. So, but his great contribution, a course on Plato's philosophy will take many years. It's very difficult if you ever attempt to read him. Remember, what you read the first time is not going to be the same as what you read the second. It's deep. He is very cryptic. He never tells you what he thinks. Difficult stuff. Beautiful. It's probably some, not everything, but some, I would say that Symposium, one of his dialogues, maybe the most beautiful thing ever written, just bar none, in any genre. It's just a thing of such beauty. So he starts this academy, and according to the tradition, it does not appear in Plato, he writes on the gate that if you don't know mathematics, don't come here. Or at least if you are not inclined to study mathematics, which is sort of the assumption, don't come here. Very, very strict. 10 years of math. It's dreadful. It's not just calculus, real mathematics. So this is a quote from somebody whom we'll encounter later on, a great mathematician in his own rank, Bartel van der Waarden, the founder of abstract algebra. So that's what he says, that the center of scientific life stood the personality of Plato. He created, when I talk about Mersenne, who became the center of the community, he became a center of community, but science existed. Plato literally starts it all. Everything, it's either done, it's never done by him, by the way. He has this wonderful idea, unlike his student Aristotle, who wants to teach himself. Plato seldom, if ever, teaches. He hires the best and the brightest. People like Theaetetus, Eudoxus, great mathematicians, truly great mathematicians. They teach. He is the president of the university. He is not supposed to have any opinions, So he hides and writes these mysterious dialogues, which students do not study, by the way. That's not what they study. That's just, he's writing for the future. The amazing thing that, all of his dialogues survive. Actually, more dialogues than he wrote survive. Which is, out of 40 which survive, he wrote 36. So people added to the corpus. So he's very, unlike anybody else, everything was preserved. So he hires physicists, he hires Aristotle, who sort of becomes a graduate student, and later on starts a competing establishment called Lyceum. This is Lyceum, right? So, which was just a garden next door to academia. But and Plato supposedly, this is a very old story, I don't know whether it's true, but it's beautiful, I have to tell you, that he would walk with the students and sort of chat with them, and they would get to the border of academia where toward Lyceum, and he would point there and say, this is the house of the bookish guy. Because Aristotle was the bookish guy, he wrote books. Plato wasn't writing books, he was very discreet about his stuff. So his contribution to mathematics is immense. He started the research program which lasts till today. Of course, sort of one of the things which we got from him is 5 regular polyhedra. You see, these are the only 5 things. Again, supposedly he was the one who discovered that, maybe other people. He never gets any credit, but he mentions them multiple times in the dialogues. These are the only solid bodies which have equal faces. There could be only 5. And we shall see later it becomes a very, very central thing. And they're very beautiful. I have them on my mantelpiece, next to the bust of Plato. They're quite beautiful. And there's some remarkable mathematics related to them. He came up, there is a wonderful story that there was an epidemic in Delos. And in Greece, whatever happens, you did one thing. What did you do? You sent a delegation to Delphi. Very good. Because you needed to know what the god Apollo, in that case, is going to tell you. And there was a marvelous thing. They would give you exactly the thing which you needed to know, except you could never figure out what it meant. I mean, like if you were a king and you wanted to start a war, it will say, start it. You will destroy a great kingdom. That's a true story. I mean, it's, yes, and he did too. Not the one he intended. So that's why we talk about Delphic prophecies, something which we cannot understand. So the delegation from Delos goes to Delphi, gets an oracle which says, the god wants you to double his altar, the size of the, and the altar of Apollo in Delphi was a cube. So, and they don't know what to do. They say, so it's 1 meter aside. He wants 2 meters aside. So, but we need to go and ask somebody who understands. So they go to Plato. Wouldn't you go to Plato if you had a really tough thing to do? I would. And he says, no, you do not understand what God wants from you. He doesn't want you to build an altar. He wants you to study mathematics. You have to figure out how to double the cube. Took a long time before we learned how to double the cube. Cubic root of 2 is a far harder problem than square root of 2 in terms of constructibility. In 1837, it was proven, well, the real mathematics was done by Gauss about 30 years before, that it cannot be done. It's an unsolvable problem. So, but again, he would try to encourage people to study mathematics. You go and study mathematics. Of course, they would rather build an altar than study mathematics. That's, self-evident. And we have a wonderful story. This is a true story, because Aristophanes was a student of Aristotle and might have known Plato, but at least knew Aristotle, who was, who spent 20 years studying with Plato. So apparently Plato never lectured, and for sure never lectured publicly, except once. At some time, I would venture a guess, somewhere around 360 BC. But it's a wild guess. I have absolutely no evidence. It's just the logic of things tells me. But I have no evidence whatsoever. So he says, I'm going to give a public lecture. And he's famous. He is world famous. This is the head of the first university. They don't know it's the first university, but they know it's something special. People from all over the world come to study with him. So they know that they will learn something important, especially about investment. So they all, the good, so they come, they expect something useful, like, a diet, investment strategy, political wisdom, whom do you vote for? And this idiot tells them to study mathematics. So apparently, well, I'm doing better than Plato. Not everybody left. In his case, everybody left. So there's some improvement at Cuba. This is Athens, by the way, the great, wonderful thing. The disenchantment was complete. They didn't like it at all. So, by the way, when he does his university, let me show you just a couple of details to show how far ahead of everybody he was. Free, no charge. Anybody could study. What do you mean anybody? A woman, a barbarian, a barbarian woman. Let me translate. An illegal immigrant. Right? Somebody who had no business being there, could go take lectures, would be treated on equal terms. Something which, not because he is rich, it's free. It's not if his father is Prime Minister of China. Sure, we take all poor, struggling children of Prime Ministers of China. But Harvard does at least. But he would take anyone, irrespective, sort of. So we're still catching up. He was very firm on absolute equality of education. Sort of, again, women have to study mathematics for 10 years, the same as men. Try to tell it to American parents. Or girls shouldn't study math. So, wonderful stuff. Now, what happens? He develops a great program of mathematics, and most people actually believe that the study of mathematics was going around this algorithm which we started studying, this GCD, subtractive GCD algorithm, and that they eventually discovered what in 18th century became a theory of continued fractions. Nor here nor there, I don't have time to cover that. It's wonderful stuff. But eventually the world changes. Remember, sort of, he lives till about 347, yes, DC. And then the world changes. His student Aristotle gets another student called Alexander. This guy Alexander decides that all this theoretical stuff is good and well. But the first thing, let us build an empire. And that was not a metaphorical empire. He is this guy who goes and conquers the world. Literally, he just goes and conquers everyone, and then dies from drunkenness and boredom. Because, I mean, what do you do after you conquer the world? It's actually a very sad fate. In his case, he was really very depressed. So, before you decide conquering the world, think about Alexander. So, but one of the things, he was a genius. He sort of goes around and does many amazing things. And of course, wherever he goes, what does he do? He collects specimens of all kinds of things, like animals, vegetables, and minerals, and sends them to Aristotle, who would classify them, write about them, and put them on display. Sadly enough, the great collection perished. Most great collections perished. But the works of Aristotle, which many of it was based on this stuff, are well preserved. So, but another thing, he finds this interesting piece of land, and he says, I'm going to build a city here, and it's going to be called, he thinks a little bit and says, Alexandria, because you see that was his name. And he starts this cultural capital of the world. So the action moves from Athens, which is a democracy, where people support the culture, to Alexandria, which for some time becomes the cultural center of the world, where people don't care about the culture, because most people don't even speak Greek. They are Egyptians, you know. The Greeks are occupying force, occupying power. I mean, they're very cultured, but they're not native. So, but their bosses, and the bosses' names are Ptolemy. It's always like Ptolemy, first Ptolemy, second Ptolemy, third Ptolemy, fourth, one after another. And it's at least first three Ptolemies, they're quite remarkable. They decide that never mind the population, we don't care about the population. We will take all the money we got and put it into culture. Yes, once upon a time, rich people did that. So, and they start these marvelous things. They start this place called Museum, which has a library and a center for studies, where they invite scholars from all over the world and pay them good money to do research without any strings attached. Isn't that wonderful? So, about 1,000 scholars. That's much bigger than Microsoft research, let me tell you. And no strings attached. They don't have to do research on studying spam. They actually, that's what our for Paul and I have friends, that's what they do. They do pure mathematics of spam. And I'm not making it up. You could ask Paul. So free room and board, you could do anything they want, and they do remarkable things. Sort of the contribution of Alexandrian scholars to what we are is immense. Because, again, what they do, they create canonical, again, some people probably know where I'm getting. I'm getting to talk about Euclid. And of course, Euclid works in Alexandria. And he's paid to write this fundamental, foundational textbook for young people called Elements, so which he does. But they do way more than that. They realize very quickly that you have to have a way of preserving. I have a friend, Paul here, who works on software preservation. He's one of the originators' idea that important software needs to be preserved. It's a great idea, and I admire Paul for that. But he's just a follower of these guys, right? Because they realize that this great patrimony which they had, the culture of Athens mostly, needs to be preserved. And to preserve it, you need to develop a system for establishing correct text and then maintaining it. Because you see, books disintegrate. It takes about 100 years for a papyrus text in a library to start disintegrating. So, if you have a huge library with 500,000 books, you need to have large body of scribes constantly copying. You have a system, rotating system, for this stuff to run. And you need to assure quality assurance that they don't just copy, because they could get drunk and copy who knows what. Start with Euclid, end with Homer, the same manuscript. So you have to have quality assurance. So they produce these remarkable ways of assuring good quality of manuscripts. They establish the canon. They decide very early on that there should be sort of, like Sophocles wrote too many plays. You couldn't assure that everybody would learn all of them. So let's select the best or most important, put them in the canon, disseminate them widely, and force everybody to study that. So they come with this idea of canon. Fortunately, for example, for Plato, all of his works end in canon. Unfortunately for Sophocles, 15% of his plays survive. Because they keep all of them in the main library. But the collection which they send around the world is just about 15% of his plays. And the loss is immense, but that's how it is. Of course, they assumed that the library would be there forever. It is not. One of the great historical questions, who burned the library of Alexandria? And let me be very ecumenical and give credit to every religion of the time. Sort of, it was first burned by Julius Caesar, who was a very well-educated person, but when he conquers Alexandria, library, it doesn't matter. I'll just go and bombard it, and it burns. Half of it survives. Then, of course, one of the Christian patriarchs starts a riot. He doesn't mean to burn it, but he does. Some of it survives, maybe. And then, of course, the Muslims come. And eventually Muslims get to cherish the stuff. But just in case, they burn it. So, it gets burned. But these are the stories. Effectively what happens, the funding stops. So the guys who are copying the manuscripts disappear. And they rot. That's the real story. It's the end of funding which caused the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, not the violence, not the 500,000 scrolls. Again, they were doing sort of collecting, translating. It's very clear that the great Greek translation of the Bible Septuaginta, Septuagint in English, was done in Alexandria. Sort of the 70 scholars from Palestine come and translate it into Greek, and we wouldn't be reading the Bible if not for them. I know the Hebrew Bible exists, but we wouldn't be reading it. Nobody would care. Then it all perishes. The remarkable fact is that the great sequence, by the way, did you observe my typographical thing on top? It's not an accident. You see, 1, 2, 3 funded like money is no object. You want to do research, go do research. And then they start sliding, because you see the Ptolemies discover that they have to play to the base. And the base in that time, the red states, were the Copts, people who didn't know Greek. And by the time we reach Ptolemy the Eighth, he decides that we have to do something about these Greeks. He's a Greek himself, by the way. But he starts terrible anti-Greek riots. All the intellectuals are expelled, or many of them expelled. Again, the funding is totally cut, and sort of building nativist feelings. So terrible things happen in history. There is a remarkable book which tries to explain how great these people were. This is Alexandria in the 3rd century. And Lucio Russo, in Italian, he's a professor in Rome. It's an amazing book in terms of, he builds this sort of very strong case that they had extremely advanced technological civilization, much more amazing than we realize, and then he tries to explain why it perishes. The important thing to remember, it did perish. And the lesson is that civilizations and cultures are very fragile. They could perish. But the important thing that before they perished, they had this guy, from our point of view. This is a picture which at least some grave authority believes might go back to Euclid. So maybe that's how Euclid looked. So what did Euclid do? We know next to nothing. I put the dates, but I don't really know. These are just approximate dates. We know nothing about Euclid. We know 2 stories about him. 2 of them are quite remarkable stories. I mean, the first story, the Ptolemy comes to him and says, I want an executive summary. I mean, I really don't have time to study elements. And he gives him the classical answer. He says, there is no royal road to geometry. There is no executive summary. You have to do the same as the rest. No, first story number 1. The second story, equally instructive, and again, some of you might be annoyed, but these are only 2 stories. Somebody listens to his first lecture and comes to him after the first lecture and asks him, how would I benefit from all of that? So he calls his slave and says, give him a 3d, a quarter, because he wants to benefit. So in any case, these are the only things we know about him. But we have this remarkable book. So lots of things we could derive from the book. It's very clear what he did. We don't know, but sort of there are unanimous agreement that he clearly brought this stuff from Athens, so he probably studied in the academy, Plato's academy. By the way, how long did it last? Anybody knows? Academy. Make a guess. Another guess. Another guess. Well, 850 would be closer. Not bad, guys. Not bad. Could you believe? I mean, there was an educational institution going sort of check for 800 some years, but didn't survive. Nothing lasts. But it's not bad. It's not bad. So he clearly started there, and not that far away from Plato. Sort of Plato was dead, but his students were Xyzippus, Plato's nephew, was in charge. And one of the reasons Aristotle opened his shop is because he figured out that he probably is not going to be elected as the president of this university. He had to start the alternative thing. So he studied and brought a bunch of different texts to Alexandria, Euclid. And then what he did, he constructed this remarkable edifice in 13 books out of different textbooks which he brought from Athens, to Alexandria. And we see the traces. There is an overreaching plan where he starts again. He starts with book 1. He builds the fundamental tools for the construction with ruler and compass. And the book 1 ends with a remarkable theorem known to you as Pythagorean theorem. But the whole edifice, the 13 books, end up with construction of 5 Platonic solids. So in one sense, it could be viewed as this one book which sort of demonstrate how, with the help of ruler and compass, construct 5 regular polyhedra, and then to prove that these are the only 5 which could exist, that no other ones. So it's a great plan, and there is a coherence. It's an amazing coherence that sort of starts from the beginning, goes to the end. But he has a bunch of other textbooks. There's also this nice textbook on number theory. So he pushes them in the middle. There's some unrelated stuff, and we could sort of recognize where they come. We could say, oh, this work comes from Eudoxus' textbook. This comes from Theaetetus. So we could guess fairly well what he does. He preserves, these 13 books constitute this, if you like, elements, ABCs of mathematics known to the Greeks. Every youngster was supposed to learn them. So, and did learn them for many, many years till it was finally destroyed in 20th century, toward the middle of the century. This is the story. What do we gain? 3 pence, remember? And about Royal Road. These are the real stories, in a sense. This is the only stories we got, nothing else. There is a wonderful little poem written by a distinguished American poet. And it is the sort of, it has this wonderful line about Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare. That's actually how the poem starts. That's the conclusion. But it's, the line repeats. And in some sense, it's still a thing of unbelievable beauty. I talked about it before. I want to mention it again, and even poets recognize that. There is something very special about this book, and the rest of us could only hear the steps of beauty. Only Euclid looked at it. And now we get back is to the famous proposition 2, that when the length of 2 unequal magnitudes segments is continually subtracted and turned from the greater, that which is left never measures the one before it. Then the 2 magnitudes are incommensurable. That is, what he says, if we run our code, remember the code when we subtract, if it doesn't terminate, then we know that there is no common measure. It's an amazing thing. So how do we know? Of course, he cheats. Then he says, and if they have a common measure, then it terminates and returns the correct answer. This is proposition 3. So when I have been again reading Euclid for many, many years, I actually have firm belief that he realized how funny it is. But he doesn't say it. It's between the lines. He knows that it's not easy to find out there is no common measure. You wait forever, and then you know. So this is again the restatement of the code. So what we do, if I changed it from recursion to iteration. So while they're not equal, you reduce the larger one by the smaller one. That's what it says. It's literally identical. This is C++ translation from the Greek. All right. So there is a problem which you have to do. Euclid proves it, and you have to try to prove it yourself. Prove that if a segment measures two other segments, then it measures their greatest common measure. We will post it so you will be able to read it time and time again before you prove it. Now, and I plan to show it to you, but because all of these outbursts which I heard about, marathon and whatever, other stuff, I'm a little bit late. I didn't cover as much as I planned by about 4 slides, which is very good because that allows me to give you a really exciting homework problem. You see, let us look back at this code. It has a problem. It's a little bit slow. Imagine that one of them is much bigger than the other. Then you keep going and going and going and going. Oh, tedious, no? Could we speed it up? These are line segments, by the way. They are not numbers. And you have ruler and compass. So this code, by the way, runs with ruler and compass. You might not believe it, but it does. I checked. So, no mod operation. You have ruler and compass. No, you have no numbers. You have ruler and compass. But you want to do faster than that. With ruler and compass, retain your insights for yourself. So it's not a very difficult problem, but I think it would be very instructive that before I show it, you implement it yourself. This is a very modest homework, so you should try to do it for a change, guys. There will be no class next week because there will be much more important announcement from Bill. There will be all hands, and you have to attend. They'll do a test. So whatever. There will be all hands, and you should attend the all hands. And then we will continue 2 weeks from now.